The camp was unusually quiet that night. Most of the soldiers were either asleep or on patrol. Inside a small, dimly lit tent, the veteran sat on his cot, wiping down his rifle. The rhythmic motion of the cleaning cloth against the metal helped calm his nerves, a habit he had picked up during his years in the field. The air was thick with the scent of oil and the faint hum of generators outside. Suddenly, the flap of the tent rustled. Kyle, his tentmate, stepped inside, his face pale and his movements hurried. The veteran looked up, immediately noticing something was off. Kyle was usually calm, almost too relaxed for a soldier. But tonight his hands were shaking, and his eyes darted around like he was being hunted. "Everything okay?" the veteran asked, his tone steady. Kyle didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down and pulled something from inside his jacket. It was wrapped in a warm piece of cloth, about the size of a small notebook. He held it out with both hands, his voice low. "Take this," he whispered. "Don't show this to anyone, not even the higher-ups." The veteran frowned, setting his rifle aside. "What is it?" "Just promise me you'll keep it safe." Kyle's voice cracked. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a sense of desperation. The veteran hesitated but took the bundle. It was heavier than it looked, and when he peeled back the cloth, he saw a sleek metallic device. It fit neatly in his palm, with a smooth surface that reflected the dim light. Strange symbols, like some kind of script, were etched along the edges. He had never seen anything like it. "What is this, Kyle?" he asked, his tone sharper now. Kyle shook his head. "I can't explain. The less you know, the better. Just trust me on this, okay?" Before the veteran could press further, Kyle stood up and moved toward the tent flap. "Wait, where are you going?" "I need to take care of something," Kyle said quickly, glancing over his shoulder. "If I'm not back by morning, you know what to do." And just like that, he was gone. The veteran sat there, staring at the device in his hands. It felt cold, almost unnaturally so, and the strange symbols seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. He didn't know what it was or why Kyle had trusted him with it, but one thing was clear: this wasn't something ordinary. He wrapped the device back in the cloth and tucked it into his gear bag, hiding it beneath a stack of supplies. His instincts told him not to leave it out in the open. If Kyle was acting this paranoid, there had to be a good reason. The night dragged on. The veteran tried to focus on cleaning his gear, but his mind kept drifting back to the device. What could it be? A weapon? A piece of tech? And why did Kyle trust him with it instead of going to their commanding officer? The hours passed slowly, and dawn was just beginning to break when the camp's alarm suddenly blared. The sharp, shrill sound jolted the veteran out of his thoughts. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, joining the other soldiers who were scrambling to their positions. "What's going on?" he asked a nearby officer. "Someone's missing," the officer replied, scanning the area. "Kyle didn't report for duty this morning. Have you seen him?" The veteran froze for a moment, his mind racing. He shook his head. "Not since last night." The officer nodded and moved on, barking orders to organize a search party. The veteran stayed behind, his thoughts a whirlwind. Kyle was missing, just as he had feared. And now the strange device felt like a ticking time bomb hidden in his gear. He needed answers, but he couldn't ask anyone. If Kyle didn't trust the higher-ups, then neither could he. For now, all he could do was wait and hope that Kyle would return. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. As the camp bustled with activity, the veteran slipped back into his tent. He pulled out the device and stared at it again, trying to make sense of the strange symbols. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling this thing was about to change everything. And he was right. The camp settled into an uneasy silence after the initial search for Kyle turned up nothing. Soldiers moved around with stiff shoulders and wary eyes, whispering theories about where he might have gone. The veteran stayed in his tent, sitting on his cot with the mysterious device now resting in his lap. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Carefully, he unwrapped the cloth and held the device up to the light. The metallic surface was cold to the touch, and the symbols etched along its edges seemed to shimmer faintly, almost as if they were alive. He turned it over in his hands, looking for any indication of what it might be. There were no buttons, switches, or seams. "What the hell are you?" he muttered under his breath. Curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight and examined the device more closely. When the beam of light hit it, The symbol suddenly glowed brighter. Startled, he almost dropped it, but then something happened that made him freeze. The device emitted a faint hum, and a small section of the surface slid open, revealing a glowing screen. The screen displayed a series of red dots scattered across a map. The veteran frowned, recognizing the outline. It was a map of their region. The dots blinked in and out, some clustered together and others spread far apart. It didn't take him long to realize what they represented. Locations. But what kind of locations? Enemy bases? Safe zones? The veteran had no idea. He grabbed a notepad and quickly sketched the map, copying down the coordinates as best as he could. If this device had triggered itself, there was no telling what else it could do. The hum grew louder for a moment before the screen flickered and went dark again. The device slid shut, returning to its original seamless form. The veteran sat back, his heart pounding. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't normal military tech. It was advanced, far beyond anything he'd ever seen. And if Kyle had it, then Kyle must have been involved in something far deeper than anyone realized. The next few hours were tense. Soldiers continued their search for Kyle, expanding their perimeter into the rocky terrain surrounding the camp. The veteran kept to himself, his mind racing as he pieced together what little information he had. By the time night fell, the camp felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Soldiers were on edge, and the officers were growing increasingly frustrated. The veteran stayed in his tent, staring at the sketch of the map. He debated whether to tell someone about the device. If the commanders found out he was hiding something this significant, he'd be court-martialed. But Kyle's warning echoed in his mind. Don't show this to anyone. Later that night, as he lay awake in his cot, he heard footsteps outside. At first, he thought it was just a passing patrol, but the steps stopped right outside his tent. His hand instinctively moved to his rifle. The tent flap rustled, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. The veteran was on his feet in an instant, aiming his weapon. "Relax," the figure said in a low voice. "I'm not here to hurt you." It was one of the soldiers from another unit, a man the veteran recognized but didn't know well. He was tall, with a thin face and sharp eyes that seemed to scan the room in an instant. "What do you want?" the veteran asked, keeping his rifle steady. The man raised his hands, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm just checking in. Word is Kyle was close to you. Figured you might know something." "I don't," the veteran replied firmly. The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, if you hear anything, let me know. Some people are very interested in what Kyle might have been hiding." Without another word, the man turned and left. The veteran lowered his rifle, his mind racing. It was clear now that he wasn't the only one looking for answers. He glanced at his gear bag, where the device was hidden. Whatever this thing was, it was dangerous, and he was starting to think Kyle had handed him more than just a piece of tech. Had handed him a target. The next morning, the camp was buzzing with activity. Soldiers moved in groups, combing through the surrounding area for any sign of Kyle. The veteran stayed on the sidelines, keeping his head down and his thoughts focused on the device. At breakfast, he overheard two officers talking near the mess tent. "Still no sign of him?" one asked. "Nothing," the other replied, shaking his head. "It's like he vanished into thin air. The CO's losing patience." The veteran finished his meal quickly and returned to his tent. He needed to act, and he needed to act fast. If Kyle wasn't found soon, the entire camp would be under suspicion, and it was only a matter of time before someone stumbled upon the device. He pulled out the sketch of the map and studied it again. The coordinates seemed random, scattered across the region with no apparent pattern. But something about the way they were arranged nagged at him, like there was a connection he couldn't see yet. Later that day, the camp received an unexpected visitor. A convoy of vehicles arrived, carrying a group of soldiers from another division. These men looked different, tougher, quieter, and far more focused than the regular troops. They wore no visible insignias, and their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, immediately called a meeting with the camp's commander. The veteran watched from a distance, his stomach nodding. He didn't need to hear what they were saying to know why they were here. As the day wore on, the tension in the camp grew unbearable. The new arrivals questioned everyone, their tone sharp and their eyes suspicious. When it was the veteran's turn, he kept his answers short and vague, sticking to the truth as much as possible without revealing anything about the device. By the time night fell, he was exhausted. but he couldn't afford to rest. The device was still humming faintly in his gear bag, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. He decided to check the map again. This time he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A faint pattern in the way the dots were arranged. It wasn't random. The coordinates were connected, forming a trail that led to a single point far from the camp. His heart sank. Kyle had given him the device for a reason, and now it was clear. He needed to follow the trail. But doing so meant leaving the camp, and once he did, there was no turning back. As he packed his gear, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle was out there somewhere, waiting for him to act. And the only way to get answers was to follow the path Kyle had left behind. The camp felt like it was under siege, not from an external enemy, but from within. The mysterious soldiers from the convoy had practically taken over. They were everywhere, questioning, searching, and watching. It didn't take long for the veteran to notice their eyes lingering on him a little too often. They weren't subtle about their suspicions. Every time he walked across the camp, he felt their gaze burning into his back. It was only a matter of time before they turned their full attention to him. The veteran sat on his cot staring at his packed gear. His rifle was cleaned and ready, his canteen filled, and his rations carefully stowed. He knew he couldn't stay much longer. If he waited for them to close in, he'd lose whatever chance he had to act. That evening, and as he prepared to slip out, something unusual caught his attention. While checking his equipment, he heard a faint buzzing noise. He froze, then followed the sound to the device. It was humming again, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. He'd unwrapped it carefully, his heart racing. This time, the screen activated on its own. The map reappeared, but something was different. A new red dot had appeared, blinking rapidly in the center of the screen. It wasn't just a static map anymore. It was tracking something or someone. Before he could fully process the change, a commotion erupted outside. Voices shouted, boots thudded against the ground, and floodlights flared to life. He quickly hid the device in his gear bag and stepped outside to see what was happening. A small drone hovered just above the camp, its sleek black frame almost invisible against the night sky. It wasn't one of theirs, that much was clear. The convoy soldiers scrambled to bring it down, but it darted and weaved through the air, avoiding every attempt to shoot it. The veteran's stomach twisted. Whoever controlled that drone wasn't just spying on the camp. They were looking for something, or someone. One of the convoy soldiers spotted him standing near his tent. "Hey, you! Get back inside!" the man barked, his tone sharp. The veteran nodded and retreated, but his mind was racing. The drone, the device, Kyle's disappearance, it was all connected. And the longer he stayed here, the more dangerous it became. Late that night, he made his move. With the camp still on high alert, it wasn't easy slipping past the patrols. But he knew the routines, the blind spots, and the weaknesses in their security. Years of experience had taught him how to move unnoticed, and he used every bit of that knowledge now. Once he was beyond the perimeter, he picked up his pace, heading toward the first set of coordinates he had copied from the device. The air was cold and dry, and the rocky terrain made every step a challenge, but he didn't stop. Hours later, as dawn began to break, he found himself at the edge of a dense forest. The coordinates were leading him straight into it. He hesitated for a moment, scanning the area. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Gripping his rifle tightly, he stepped into the shadows of the trees, every sense on high alert. The forest was thick, the branches overhead forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The veteran moved carefully, his boots crunching softly against the underbrush. The coordinates led him deeper and deeper into the woods, each step taking him further from the relative safety of the camp. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every so often he would stop and listen, his finger resting on the trigger of his rifle. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. Then he heard it, a faint rustling behind him. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly he turned, raising his weapon. Nothing. He scanned the area, his eyes darting between the trees. The shadows seemed to shift and move, but he saw no sign of anyone or anything. He waited for a few moments, then continued forward, his grip on his rifle tightening. An hour later, the coordinates led him to a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered stone marker, covered in moss and vines. It looked ancient, out of place in the middle of the forest, but it was the exact spot the device had pointed him to. He approached cautiously, circling the marker and inspecting it from all angles. There was no sign of Kyle or anyone else, just the strange, solitary stone. But as he got closer, he noticed something carved into its surface. Symbols. They were the same symbols that were etched into the device. Reaching into his gear bag, he pulled the device out. As soon as it was exposed, the symbols on the stone began to glow, pulsing in sync with the ones on the device. The hum returned, louder now, almost deafening. Before he could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the trees. He spun around, raising his rifle, just as a group of figures emerged from the shadows. There were 5 of them, all dressed in dark tactical gear. Their faces were obscured by masks, and their weapons were trained on him. "Drop the device," one of them ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The veteran didn't move. He knew the odds weren't in his favor, but he wasn't about to hand over the device without a fight. "Last chance," the man said, stepping closer. The veteran took a deep breath, his mind racing. Then, in one swift motion, he hurled the device toward the stone marker and dove for cover. The device hit the marker and shattered, releasing a blinding flash of light. The figures yelled in confusion, their formation breaking as they tried to shield their eyes. Taking advantage of the chaos, the veteran opened fire. His shots were precise, taking down 2 of the attackers before they could recover. The others returned fire, forcing him to retreat behind a tree. The firefight was intense, the air filled with the deafening sound of gunfire and the acrid smell of smoke. The veteran moved quickly, using the trees for cover as he picked off his enemies one by one. When the last attacker fell, the clearing went silent. The veteran stood there, breathing heavily, his rifle still raised. He glanced at the stone marker. The device was gone, its remains scattered across the ground. But the symbols on the stone were still glowing faintly, a reminder that this was far from over. With no time to waste, he gathered what he could from the attackers and disappeared into the forest. He had survived the encounter, but the real danger was only beginning. The forest was eerily silent as the veteran trudged forward, his boots crunching softly against the dry leaves. The encounter in the clearing weighed heavily on his mind. He had barely escaped with his life, and now, with the device destroyed, he had nothing to guide him except the hastily sketched map and his instincts. He paused to catch his breath, leaning against a tree. The faint light of dawn filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. Pulling out the map, he studied the remaining coordinates. There were 2 more locations, but he had no idea what he was supposed to find or how dangerous they would be. He chose the nearest one, about 20 kilometers north. It would take a day's trek to reach it, and he'd need to stay vigilant. If those attackers were tracking him, they wouldn't give up easily. As the hours passed, the forest began to change. The dense foliage gave way to rocky terrain, and the trees grew sparse. The veteran stopped frequently to check his surroundings, his rifle at the ready. He had the feeling he was being watched, though he couldn't spot any signs of pursuit. Around midday, he came across a shallow stream. The cool water was a welcome relief, and he took the opportunity to refill his canteen. As he knelt by the water, something caught his eye, a faint glint in the distance. He froze, scanning the area carefully. There it was again, a flicker of light reflecting off something metallic. Slowly he crept closer, using the terrain for cover. What he found made his heart race. Hidden among the rocks was a small metal case, half buried in the dirt. It was about the size of a briefcase, with no visible markings except for a series of numbers etched into the top. The numbers matched the coordinates on his map. Carefully he examined the case. It wasn't locked, but it felt heavy, as if something important was inside. He opened it slowly, his nerves on edge. Inside was a collection of items, a small notebook filled with handwritten notes, a flash drive, and a folded piece of paper with more of the strange symbols he had seen on the device and the stone marker. The veteran picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. Most of the writing was in a language he didn't recognize, but a few lines were in English. One sentence stood out: "They're watching everything." As he packed up the case, the sound of a twig snapping nearby jolted him to attention. He spun around, rifle raised, scanning the area. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. There was no response, but the forest felt different now, charged, as if it were holding its breath. Then, without warning, a gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past his head, embedding itself in a tree behind him. The veteran dove for cover, returning fire in the direction of the shot. The ambush was swift and coordinated. Figures in dark tactical gear emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on him. He counted at least 3, maybe more. The veteran's training kicked in. He moved quickly, using the rocks and trees as cover while firing back. The attackers were relentless, but they underestimated his experience. With calculated precision, he took them down one by one, leaving only silence in the aftermath. After securing the area, the veteran examined the bodies. They had no identification, just like the ones in the clearing. However, one of them carried a small radio, its display flashing with an incoming transmission. He picked it up, listening carefully. A voice crackled through the static. "Report. Have you secured the target?" The veteran didn't answer. He switched off the radio and pocketed it, his mind racing. Whoever these people were, they had resources in numbers, and they were clearly after him. He couldn't stay here. With the case securely strapped to his pack, he set off toward the next set of coordinates, his senses sharper than ever. By nightfall, the veteran had covered several kilometers, the forest giving way to open plains. The map indicated that the next set of coordinates was close, but there was no visible landmark in sight. He camped under the stars, keeping his fire small to avoid detection. Sleep came in short bursts, his body too tense to fully relax. Each rustle of the wind or distant howl made his hand tighten around his rifle. At dawn, he resumed his journey. The terrain grew rougher, with jagged rocks and steep inclines. As he approached the coordinates, he noticed something unusual, an unnatural mound of earth, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. Upon closer inspection, he found what looked like a hatch, its edges rusted but intact. It was locked, but the lock was simple enough to pick. After a few tense minutes, the hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air inside was cool and stale, carrying the scent of metal and damp earth. The veteran descended cautiously, his rifle leading the way. The stairs ended in a small chamber, illuminated by dim emergency lights. The bunker was compact but well-equipped. There were shelves lined with supplies, a small table with a stack of documents, and a terminal blinking softly in the corner. He approached the table first, sifting through the papers. Most of them were indecipherable, filled with the same strange symbols. But among them he found a photograph, a grainy image of Kyle standing with a group of men, all dressed in civilian clothes. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note: "Trust is a luxury you can't afford." The veteran's grip tightened on the photo. Kyle was deeper in this than he had imagined, and the more he uncovered, the less he understood. Turning his attention to the terminal, he powered it on. The screen flickered to life, displaying a login prompt. He tried a few basic combinations, but quickly realized it required a code. His frustration mounted, but then he remembered the notebook from the case. Flipping through its pages, he found a string of numbers that looked like a password. He entered them into the terminal, and the screen changed. A series of files appeared, each labeled with cryptic names. He opened the first one, and his blood ran cold. It was a detailed report on surveillance operations targeting military personnel, including his own unit. The veteran read in silence, piecing together the implications. Kyle hadn't just stumbled onto this. He had been part of it. And now, by taking the device, the veteran had placed himself squarely in the crosshairs. Suddenly, a sharp beep echoed through the bunker. The terminal screen displayed a warning. Signal detected. Reinforcements en route. The veteran cursed under his breath. They were coming, and he had minutes, maybe seconds, to escape. He grabbed what he could, the notebook, the photo, and a flash drive from the terminal, and bolted up the stairs. As he emerged into the daylight, he heard the distant roar of engines. They had found him. The roar of engines grew louder as the veteran sprinted away from the bunker. The open plains offered little cover, and he knew the enemy would spot him within minutes. His legs burned and his gear weighed him down, but he couldn't afford to slow. Glancing back, he saw 2 black vehicles cresting the hill, their headlights cutting through the early morning haze. Dust trailed behind them, marking their relentless approach. The veteran scanned the terrain ahead and spotted a dry creek bed weaving through the plain. It wasn't much, but it was his best chance to evade pursuit. He slid down into the creek bed, keeping low as the vehicles closed in. The sound of engines echoed against the rock walls, making it hard to gauge their exact position. The veteran moved quickly, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around him, sending shards of stone flying. He dove for cover behind a large boulder, gripping his rifle tightly. The attackers were skilled, but they were overconfident. The veteran peered around the edge of the boulder, spotting one of the vehicles stopped nearby. A figure emerged, weapon raised, scanning the area. The veteran steadied his breathing, aimed, and fired. The attacker dropped instantly. Using the confusion, he bolted further down the creek bed. The second vehicle skidded to a halt, and more figures spilled out, shouting orders. They spread out, searching the area. The veteran climbed up the creek wall, his movements silent and deliberate. From his vantage point, he saw the attackers fanning out below. He picked them off one by one, his shots precise and lethal. The skirmish was over in minutes, leaving only silence. As he searched the bodies, he found more clues about his pursuers. Their gear was state-of-the-art, but there were no insignias or identifying marks. However, one of them carried a small device, a GPS tracker. The screen displayed the same coordinates he had just left, along with a blinking dot that marked his current location. They had been tracking him. The veteran smashed the tracker against a rock, silencing it for good. But the damage was done. They knew his general location, and reinforcements wouldn't be far behind. He moved quickly, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of the fight. His mind raced as he pieced together what he had learned. The bunker, the files, the photo of Kyle. It all pointed to something much bigger than he had anticipated. The veteran decided to head toward the final set of coordinates on the map. It was his only lead, and he had no other options. Whatever was waiting for him there, he had to face it. By the time night fell, he had reached the edge of a dense forest. The coordinates indicated the location was somewhere within. The veteran set up a small camp, hidden beneath a cluster of trees. He ate a cold meal, his senses on high alert for any signs of pursuit. As he sat in the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs made his hand tighten around his rifle. He didn't sleep that night, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. When dawn broke, he packed up his gear and headed into the forest. The forest was thick and disorienting, with no clear paths to follow. The veteran relied on his map and compass to guide him, but the dense undergrowth slowed his progress. The air was heavy with humidity, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the shadows. After hours of navigating the forest, he stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The roof sagged and the walls were covered in moss and vines, but it matched the coordinates on his map. The veteran approached cautiously, scanning the area for traps or signs of activity. The cabin appeared deserted, but he didn't let his guard down. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, stepping inside. The interior was sparse, with only a broken table and a few empty shelves. However, in the corner of the room, he noticed a small metal box, partially buried under debris. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a collection of items: a handwritten letter, a folded map, and a small vial filled with an unknown liquid. The letter was from Kyle. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. I'm sorry for dragging you into this, but I had no choice. The device was our only chance to expose the truth. They're watching everything, our communications, our movements, even our thoughts. Trust no one. This vial contains a countermeasure. If they catch you, they'll use something to break you. This will protect you for a short time. The final coordinates hold the answer. You'll understand everything when you get there. Stay strong, brother." The veteran read the letter twice, his mind reeling. Kyle had been in deeper than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about the device or the files. This was about survival against a force that seemed omnipresent. He examined the vial, its contents glowing faintly in the dim light. He didn't know what it was, but he decided to keep it. If Kyle thought it was important, it was worth holding on to. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside snapped him back to the present. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out cautiously. A group of figures was approaching the cabin, their weapons drawn. They moved with precision, clearly professionals. The veteran knew he couldn't take them all head-on. He needed a plan. He quickly stashed the letter and the map in his gear, then moved to the back of the cabin. As the attackers closed in, he slipped out through a broken window and disappeared into the forest. Using his knowledge of the terrain, he set a series of traps to slow them down. He led them deeper into the woods, where the thick undergrowth gave him the advantage. One by one, the attackers fell into his traps: tripwires, hidden pits, and sharp stakes concealed beneath leaves. The veteran moved like a ghost, striking from the shadows and disappearing before they could react. By the time the fight was over, the forest was silent once again. The veteran stood amidst the wreckage, his heart pounding but his resolve stronger than ever. Kyle's final message echoed in his mind. The final coordinates held the answer, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The forest was behind him now, but the journey was far from over. The veteran had spent 2 days navigating rough terrain, avoiding patrols, and following the map Kyle had left behind. The final set of coordinates was etched into his mind: a remote location deep in the mountains, miles away from any known settlement. The air grew colder as he ascended, the rocky trail cutting through jagged cliffs and steep inclines. His boots crunched against loose gravel, and every step felt heavier than the last. Despite the exhaustion, he pushed forward, his mind focused on what lay ahead. By midday, he reached a plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. He pulled out his map and double-checked the coordinates. The location was close, but there was no visible structure or landmark. All he saw was a cluster of rocks and a sheer cliff face. "Where is it?" he muttered under his breath. As he scanned the area, something caught his eye. A faint line etched into the cliff, almost like a seam. It was subtle, barely visible against the natural stone. He approached cautiously, running his hand along the surface. There was a slight vibration beneath his fingertips. This wasn't just a cliff. It was an entrance. The veteran searched for a way to open it, his hands brushing against the rocks. Finally, he found a small indentation, barely larger than his thumb. It was the same shape as one of the symbols he had seen on the device and in the bunker. He hesitated, then pressed his thumb against the indentation. The vibration grew stronger, and a low rumble echoed through the air. Slowly, a section of the cliff slid open, revealing a dark passageway leading into the mountain. He stepped inside, his rifle raised. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of metal and earth. The passage was narrow, lined with smooth walls that hinted at advanced construction. It felt like he was walking into the heart of something ancient and powerful. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, dimly lit by a series of glowing panels along the walls. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat another device, similar to the one Kyle had given him but larger and more intricate. Approaching the pedestal, the veteran noticed a terminal embedded in the base. The screen displayed a single prompt: input authorization code. He reached into his pack and pulled out the notebook he had found earlier. Flipping through the pages, he found a sequence of numbers and symbols that looked like a code. He entered it carefully, his fingers steady despite the tension coursing through him. The terminal beeped, and the room came to life. The panels along the walls lit up, displaying maps, charts, and streams of data. It was overwhelming. Information about troop movements, covert operations, and classified projects. One screen caught his attention. It displayed a list of names, and his was among them. Next to his name was a series of notes: subject under observation, potential liability. His stomach tightened. They had been watching him for months, maybe even years. This wasn't just about Kyle or the device. This was about control. As he absorbed the information, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You shouldn't have come here." The veteran spun around, rifle raised. A figure stepped out of the shadows, dressed in tactical gear similar to the attackers he had faced earlier. But this man wasn't armed. "I know what you're thinking," the man said, his tone calm. "You think you've uncovered some great conspiracy, but you don't understand the stakes." The veteran didn't lower his weapon. "Start talking." The man sighed, gesturing to the screens. "This is bigger than you, bigger than your unit, bigger than any of us. We're fighting a war that no one can know about. Kyle thought he could change things, but all he did was put you in danger." "What kind of war?" the veteran demanded. The man hesitated, then said, "A war for control. Surveillance, influence, manipulation. It's all part of the game. The device you had, it was just a tool, a piece of the puzzle. You're not supposed to be here, and now you've seen too much." Before the veteran could respond, alarms blared throughout the chamber. The man's expression darkened. "They're coming. You need to leave. Now." "I'm not going anywhere until I get answers," the veteran said firmly. The man shook his head. "You won't get the truth from me, and you definitely won't get it from them. Take what you've learned and run. It's the only way you'll survive." The veteran hesitated, torn between staying to uncover more on the growing sense of urgency. Finally, he grabbed a flash drive from the terminal, copying as much data as he could. The man stepped aside, gesturing toward an exit on the far side of the chamber. "Go, before it's too late." The veteran didn't trust him, but he had no choice. He bolted toward the exit, his boots pounding against the floor. As he reached the tunnel, the sound of explosions rocked the chamber behind him. He emerged into the open air just as the entrance collapsed, sealing whatever was inside forever. He didn't look back, his mind racing with everything he had seen and heard. Kyle's words echoed in his mind. The final coordinates hold the answer. But instead of clarity, he was left with more questions, and the nagging sense that this was only the beginning. The mountain was behind him, but the danger wasn't. The veteran moved quickly, keeping his head low and his senses sharp. The destruction of the chamber had bought him time, but he knew it wouldn't stop whoever was after him. If anything, it would make them more desperate to catch him. The air was cold, and the rocky terrain stretched out endlessly before him. He had no clear destination, only the flash drive in his pocket, and the faint hope it held answers. His mind replayed the stranger's words in the chamber. "You're not supposed to be here. Take what you've learned and run." What kind of war was this? And why had Kyle dragged him into it? By nightfall, he reached the edge of the mountain range. The land flattened into a barren plain, dotted with sparse vegetation. He found a small cave to take shelter in and started a small fire for warmth. His rations were running low, but hunger was the least of his concerns. He pulled out the flash drive, turning it over in his hands. It was a small, unassuming object, but it held the key to everything he had uncovered. His thoughts drifted to Kyle. Somewhere along the way, his friend had chosen to fight this shadowy war, and now it seemed the fight had passed to him. The veteran leaned back against the cold stone wall, his rifle resting by his side. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, broken by the faintest of sounds outside. The next morning, he resumed his journey, heading toward the closest known settlement. It was a small village about 30 kilometers away, a place where he could resupply, and, if he was lucky, find a way to analyze the data on the flash drive. The journey was grueling. The plains offered no cover, and every step felt exposed. The sun beat down relentlessly, and his canteen was nearly empty. He pushed on, knowing that stopping wasn't an option. By late afternoon, he spotted the village in the distance, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by farmland. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint sound of livestock carried on the wind. The veteran approached cautiously, staying out of sight as he observed the area. It seemed quiet, ordinary, and untouched by the chaos he had been through. But he knew better than to let his guard down. He entered the village as discreetly as possible, keeping his hood up and his rifle slung over his shoulder. The locals gave him curious looks but didn't ask questions. In a place like this, strangers passing through were probably not uncommon. He found a small general store and stocked up on essentials, water, food, and ammunition. The shopkeeper, an older man with a thick accent, eyed him warily but didn't pry. "Anything else?" the man asked as the veteran counted out the cash. "No," the veteran replied, his tone clipped. "Thanks." As he left the store, he spotted a small cafe with a few tables outside. It was empty except for an old radio playing static in the background. He sat at one of the tables, pulling out a small laptop he had taken from the attackers in the forest. The laptop powered on, and he inserted the flash drive. A password prompt appeared on the screen. He frowned, then pulled out Kyle's notebook, flipping through its pages. In the margin of one page, he found a string of numbers and letters that looked like a password. He entered the code, and the drive unlocked. The screen filled with folders, each labeled with cryptic names. He opened the first folder and found detailed reports, maps, and surveillance logs. One document caught his attention: Project Veil, Overview. The veteran read quickly, his eyes narrowing. The project was a covert operation designed to monitor and manipulate military personnel. It involved advanced surveillance, psychological manipulation, and experimental technology. Tools to control the minds and actions of soldiers without their knowledge. Kyle's words echoed in his mind. They're watching everything. Before he could delve deeper, the sound of an engine caught his attention. He looked up to see a black SUV pulling into the village. His heart sank as two men in tactical gear stepped out, scanning the area. They had found him. The veteran shut the laptop and pocketed the flash drive. He grabbed his gear and slipped out the back of the cafe, keeping to the shadows. The men moved methodically, questioning the locals and checking every building. He needed to get out of the village before they cornered him. Staying low, he made his way toward the outskirts, avoiding the main roads. As he reached the edge of the village, a voice called out behind him, "Stop right there." The veteran turned to see one of the men raising a weapon. Without hesitation, he dove behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the air. He returned fire, the sharp cracks of his rifle echoing through the streets. The villagers scattered, shouting in panic as the firefight intensified. The veteran moved quickly, using the terrain to his advantage. He took down one of the men with a precise shot, but more vehicles were approaching in the distance. Realizing he couldn't win this fight, he retreated into the open plains, leaving the village behind. As the sun set, he found himself alone once again, the vast expanse of land stretching out before him. The flash drive was still in his possession, but the enemy was closing in. He couldn't keep running forever. If he wanted to survive, he needed to strike first. The veteran tightened his grip on his rifle and pressed on, determined to end this on his own terms. The plains stretched endlessly ahead, offering little cover as the veteran pushed forward under the fading light of the setting sun. He was exhausted, running on sheer willpower and instinct, but his mind was sharp. The flash drive in his possession was the key to everything: Kyle's sacrifice, the attackers, and the war he had inadvertently stepped into. After hours of trudging across the barren landscape, he spotted a cluster of jagged rocks ahead, forming a natural outcropping. It wasn't much, but it offered enough shelter to set up a temporary camp. The veteran climbed into the crevices, ensuring he was out of sight before unpacking his gear. Sitting in the shadow of the rocks, he pulled out the flash drive and the stolen laptop. The files he had accessed earlier hinted at a vast operation, Project Veil, designed to monitor and manipulate soldiers, but he needed more clarity. He powered up the laptop again, entering the passcode to unlock the files. This time he opened a folder labeled Active Operations. The contents were chilling. The files detailed surveillance reports on multiple military units, including his own. The veteran's name appeared several times, along with notes about his movements, interactions, and psychological profile. The project had been targeting him for months, even before Kyle's involvement. Another file caught his attention: node locations. It listed several sites across the region, each marked as a control hub for Project Veil. One of the sites was only a few kilometers from his current position. The veteran clenched his fists. He finally had a lead, a chance to strike back. The following morning he set out toward the node. The rocky terrain made for slow progress, but it also provided some cover from the enemy's surveillance. He moved cautiously, scanning the horizon for any signs of pursuit. By midday he reached the node's location. It was hidden in plain sight, a small, nondescript building that blended seamlessly into the landscape. The veteran observed it from a distance, using his binoculars to scout the area. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements routine and predictable. There was no visible signage, but the building's reinforced doors and faint hum of power told him it was more than it appeared. The veteran waited until nightfall before making his move. Under the cover of darkness, he crept toward the building, using the terrain to stay hidden. When one of the guards passed near his position, he struck swiftly, taking the man down with a chokehold. He dragged the unconscious guard into the shadows, stripping him of his weapon and communication device. The second guard was easier. Distracted by a cigarette, he never saw the veteran coming. Inside the building, the air was cool and sterile. The veteran moved silently through the narrow hallways, his rifle at the ready. The interior was of stark contrast to its plain exterior. Walls lined with monitors displayed lit feeds from surveillance drones, and rows of servers hummed with activity. He found a terminal near the center of the building and plugged in the flash drive. The files on the terminal mirrored what he had seen earlier, but included additional details about Project Veil's objectives. The project wasn't just about monitoring soldiers. It was about control. The technology was designed to implant subliminal messages, alter perceptions, and manipulate decisions. It was a weapon of psychological warfare, capable of turning even the most loyal soldiers into unwitting pawns. The veteran's hands tightened into fists as he read. Kyle hadn't just uncovered a conspiracy. He had discovered a weapon that could destabilize entire armies. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The veteran yanked the flash drive from the terminal and ducked into the shadows. Two men entered the room, their voices low. "Command wants everything wiped," one of them said. "They know he's getting close." The veteran's pulse quickened. He couldn't let them destroy the evidence. As the men began accessing the terminal, the veteran struck. His movements were swift and precise, taking them down before they could react. He disabled the terminal's self-destruct protocol and downloaded as much data as he could onto the flash drive. The alarms blared moments later, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. The veteran moved quickly, setting charges around the room. If he couldn't carry everything out, he made sure no one else could use it. As the first wave of attackers breached the building, the veteran detonated the charges, collapsing part of the structure and buying himself time to escape. Under the cover of smoke and chaos, he slipped into the night, the flash drive clutched tightly in his hand. The node was destroyed, but the war was far from over. The veteran found temporary refuge in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small village. He needed time to regroup and figure out his next move. The data he had recovered from the node was extensive, but he lacked the resources to analyze it fully. As he sat by the faint glow of a lantern, flipping through the files, a name caught his attention: Lachlan Station. It was mentioned multiple times as a central hub for Project Veil's operations. If he could reach it, he might find the answers he needed to bring the entire project down. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. The next day, the veteran made his way to a nearby contact, an old ally from his Special Forces days. Marcus had retired years ago, but he still had connections and a knack for getting things done off the grid. The veteran approached Marcus's safe house, a rundown cabin hidden deep in the woods. He knocked twice on the door, then waited. Marcus opened the door cautiously, a shotgun in hand. His expression softened when he recognized the veteran. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't seen you in years. Come in." Inside, the cabin was cluttered but secure. The veteran quickly explained the situation, showing Marcus the flash drive and outlining what he had uncovered. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is big," he said finally. "Too big for just the two of us, but I've got some people who might be willing to help." Over the next few hours, Marcus made a series of encrypted calls. By nightfall, a small group of operatives had arrived at the cabin, former soldiers, hackers, and specialists who had all worked with Marcus at some point. The veteran briefed them on what he had learned, outlining a plan to infiltrate Lachlan Station and expose Project Veil. The mission was dangerous, but the group was resolute. "If we don't stop this," the veteran said, his voice firm, "they'll use it to control everything. Soldiers, civilians, governments, no one will be safe." Marcus nodded. "Then we hit them hard and fast. No second chances." As the team prepared for the mission, the veteran felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since Kyle had handed him the device, he wasn't alone. Together, they would take the fight to the enemy. And this time, he wouldn't stop until Project Veil was destroyed for good. The journey to Lachlan Station was long and fraught with danger. The team moved under the cover of darkness, using Marcus's connections to secure transport and avoid detection. The veteran sat quietly in the back of a modified truck, his mind focused on the task ahead. Lachlan Station was more than just a hub for Project Veil. It was a fortress. Hidden in a remote valley, the facility was surrounded by high walls, surveillance drones, and heavily armed guards. It was the heart of the operation, and taking it down would require precision and coordination. The team stopped a few kilometers away from the station to finalize their plan. Marcus spread out a map of the facility, pointing to key areas. "The main server room is here," he said, tapping the map. "That's where they're running everything. If we can get in and upload the virus, we'll cripple the entire network." The veteran nodded, studying the map. "What about backup systems?" "They have redundancies," Marcus admitted. "But the virus will spread to those too. We just need to buy enough time to finish the upload." The plan was simple but dangerous. The team would split into two groups, one to create a distraction and draw the guards away, and the other to infiltrate the server room and plant the virus. The veteran volunteered to lead the infiltration team. As they approached the station, the tension was palpable. The distraction team set off an explosion near the outer wall, triggering alarms and drawing the guards away. The veterans team used the chaos to slip through a hidden tunnel Marcus had identified earlier. Inside the station was a maze of sterile corridors and high-tech equipment. The veteran moved with purpose, his rifle at the ready. Every step brought them closer to the server room, and closer to danger. They encountered resistance along the way, but the team worked like a well-oiled machine, neutralizing guards with swift efficiency. The veteran led the way, his instincts honed by years of experience. Finally, they reached the server room. The air hummed with the sound of machinery, and rows of servers stretched out before them. Marcus's hacker, a wiry man named Theo, quickly got to work, plugging the virus into the main terminal. The alarms changed pitch, signaling that the guards were regrouping. "How much longer?" the veteran asked, his eyes on the door. 3 minutes, Theo replied, typing furiously. The veteran and the others held their ground as guards began to pour into the corridor. The firefight was intense, bullets ricocheting off walls as both sides fought fiercely. The veterans' team held the line, buying Theo the time he needed. Finally, Theo shouted, "It's done. The virus is uploading." The veteran nodded. Time to move. They fought their way out, retreating through the same tunnel they had used to enter. Explosions echoed behind them as the virus disrupted the station's systems, triggering a chain reaction that disabled the facility's defenses. As they emerged into the night, the veteran looked back at the station. Smoke billowed from the structure, and the sound of sirens faded into the distance. They had done it. The team regrouped at a safe house miles away from Lackland Station. Everyone was battered and exhausted, but the sense of victory was palpable. The veteran sat at a table, staring at the flash drive in his hands. The virus had destroyed Project Veil's main network, but the data they had recovered from the station was equally important. It contained names, operations, and plans, evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Marcus sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee. "What's next?" he asked. The veteran sighed. "We take this public. The world needs to know what they've been doing." "Won't be easy," Marcus said. "They'll fight back hard." "They always do," the veteran replied. "But we have the truth on our side. That's all we need." The team worked tirelessly over the next few days, compiling the data and sending it to trusted journalists and whistleblower organizations. The response was immediate and explosive. News of Project Veil spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and investigations across the globe. The veteran watched the coverage from a distance, knowing that his role in the fight was over. Kyle's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The world now knew the truth, and those responsible for Project Veil would be held accountable. But his journey wasn't over. The veteran packed his gear and prepared to move on, leaving the safe house behind. As he stepped out into the morning light, he felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering question. What other shadows were out there, waiting to be uncovered? He adjusted his pack and started walking, ready to face whatever came next.